Hey everyone, welcome to the Bread of Life channel. I'm really excited about our talk tonight. I'm here with James Fodor. Here he is. Hey James, how are you?
I'm all right, thanks. How are you?
Good. It's great to see you. So it's hard to introduce James Fodor because he does so many things, but I'm going to give my best shot here. He's a scientist. He has a graduate degree in physics. He's worked in biology. He's currently working on his PhD in neuroscience. He has just a long list of accomplishments and a lot of interests. He's written a book that's kind of a counter apologetics book. You can find it's called An Unreasonable Faith, and it's linked in the description of the video, as well as his favorite thing. I mean, my favorite thing that he does, which is a podcast called The Science of Everything, where he basically has, podcasts on various aspects of, different things in the natural world. And it's just a great podcast. So anyway, welcome, James.
Yeah, thanks. It's a pleasure to be along again.
Yeah. So last year, I asked James to read this book, The Stairway to Life, by Change Loratan and Rob Stadler. It's called The Stairway to Life, an Origin of Life reality check. And of course, my motivation in having James read this book is I want James to know that God loves him, and that, hey, the origin of life might be one of those areas where, when you realize the difficulties with life coming about by natural processes, maybe it can awaken someone's awareness of the creator. So I don't know. But anyway, now James is going to respond and kind of give me his reaction to this book, and we're going to kind of talk through that. So, yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. So I'm not exactly sure where you want to start. Maybe we could talk about which parts of the book you found most interesting or compelling.
Well, I'm more interested in your thoughts on this book, but sure. Well, I would say, as I read through, it seemed like the book kind of takes you through the things that would have to be in place for life to come about. And as you're going through, it's like these things keep mounting that make it seem impossible for life to come about by natural processes. So there's so many chicken and egg problems. You've got to have, DNA, RNA, and proteins all working together. You've got to have a membrane that allows nutrients and various things into the cell while keeping out other things. And then you've got that, energy issue of harnessing energy. How is the cell going to harness energy? And, the complicated machinery that is in place, even in our simplest life forms, what goes into causing a cell having energy to do all of the processes that it does. So and then of course the homochirality issue. So there's like a lot of different things that go in, and so I don't know, I'd like to hear your thoughts about it.
Yeah, so the book I think does a good job at presenting the different stages, or they call it stairs, right? In the early evolution of life, and that was one of the few things that I liked about the book, is the way that it divided it up like that. I think, so my camera's been playing up lately, so apologies about that.
Okay.
I'll see if I can keep that working. It's very inconsistent. Sometimes it works fine, and then sometimes it doesn't. But anyways, yeah, I think one of the things that I found most frustrating about the book is that it's not very clear what the argument is supposed to look like, in terms of that they say at the end of the book that they take the origin of life and the difficulties that they present, that you just sort of mentioned briefly, as being evidence for the existence of God. But they don't really explain why that's evidence for the existence of God. And I think that the fact that they don't really draw that link very clearly is a major flaw, right? Because for example, they continually say throughout the book that there are that in order to explain the various steps in the stairway to life, that scientists have to postulate certain processes or mechanisms that are not fully observable or that we haven't fully documented. And they say that this is speculative, imaginary entities to fill numerous gaps and so forth. But then their proposed explanation is just that God did it, right? They don't really have anything more to say than that. And it's not really clear to me why that's supposed to be a better explanation, right? Because for each of the different steps, it seems that all they have to say about the matter is, well, God just sort of did it that way. And I don't know how they don't really explain why that's a better explanation than postulating a naturalistic mechanism that may not be fully observable. But so that's why I'm interested in sort of unpacking what you think. What you think the approach to this sort of question should be. Like, how do we evaluate competing explanations? Because they don't really try to do that in the book.
Okay, so I guess for me, what the book is pointing out, it is just simply that natural processes are not enough to explain how this happened. So, of course, if we were to say God did it, and which I think is a good explanation, but it's not a scientific explanation. So it's not really one that we can test, right? It's not one that we can say, and here's how he did it by such and such process, because, it wasn't through a process that we can observe. So I don't know if the explanation that I think is correct for life can be evaluated by natural process. I mean, by scientific observation. It's kind of one of those things that it's more like when you rule out certain explanations, then you take what is the best option remaining.
Yeah, so I think that's I think that's what they're sort of trying to do here, but I don't. That approach doesn't make sense to me because they don't rule out naturalistic hypotheses. What they do is they present various difficulties for naturalistic hypotheses, and then throughout they use all sorts of quotes to cast aspersions on those. For example, just a few quotes here in chapter 12. Contradicts common sense, strains the imagination. They say strains the imagination again. They talk about like mystical naturalistic entities. They talk about how scientists are biased towards looking for naturalistic explanations, and that this is like the entirety of what the science of biogenesis is focused on, is just trying to like concoct different explanations to sort of save naturalism and things like this. But I mean, and so those sort of comments I find are annoying, but they at no point do they rule out any of the naturalistic hypotheses. All they have to say is that the explanations are incomplete or they're unlikely for various reasons. The problem with that is that if the God explanation is incomplete and or unlikely for various reasons to an even greater extent, then we should still prefer an incomplete and unlikely naturalistic hypothesis. So unless you can show that there's some sort of impossibility or logical contradiction in the naturalistic hypothesis, which they don't claim to do, then you can't say that it's ruled out. What you can say is, well, maybe it's implausible, but if an alternative explanation is even less plausible, then we should still go with an implausible one, right? So it's still a comparative exercise. You can't just not look at one and only look at the other and say you've ruled it out, unless you can show a logical contradiction. You haven't actually ruled it out. You've just rendered it implausible, but it still may be more plausible than the alternative. Sorry, I'm muted.
Do you think it is more plausible than the alternative?
Sorry, the naturalistic hypothesis?
Yeah. Do you think, the naturalistic hypothesis is more plausible than the alternative God created?
Right. So, I mean, yeah, we haven't talked about any of the details yet. I just wanted to talk about the framework, which I think they do in the wrong order in the book. They put the framework at the very end. But yeah, I think that most of the issues that they raise in the book have been, well, I mean, they talk about this, right? Most of the issues that they discuss in the book have been researched extensively by mainstream science, and I think that there are plausible explanations on the table. Now, the thing is that this is one of the things that I dislike about the book, because for every single thing that is unknown, that we don't have an answer for, will have like things that we don't know about it, and available explanations will be unsatisfactory, precisely because we don't know what the answer is, right? So this book is about the origin of life, but I could do this for literally anything. Any of the fields I've studied have any academic field has areas that are unknown, right? And so for any of those things, you could take unanswered questions and do the same thing, and show the problems with all extant explanations and the things that are currently unknown. And you could say, well, on the basis of all of these difficulties, we've ruled out the naturalistic explanations, right? But that's foolish, because all you've done is shown that we don't know the answer. What you would have to do is show that it's more plausible that the alternative, say a supernatural or a divine explanation, provides a superior fit to the data, a superior explanation to the data than does any available naturalistic hypothesis. But they don't do that in this book. All that they show is that our understanding is limited. Now, I think they exaggerate the extent of our ignorance, but of course we could argue about that, right? Clearly, there are things that we don't know. I find it frustrating that in many of their chapters they present possible explanations and then just sort of say that they're implausible without really explaining why. And we could look at specifics if you would like, but the underlying point is not, because I would, even if we didn't have any good explanations for these things from a naturalistic point of view, it's not clear to me that they have anything superior to say other than for each of these things. Like, well, how did the building blocks of life form? Well, I guess God formed them. How did homochirality emerge, or why? Well, I guess God wanted life to be homochiral for some reason. How did the monomers link together in a consistent way? Well, I don't know. I guess God linked it up that way because he wanted to. Like, how did the membrane of the cell emerge? Well, I don't know. I guess God made a membrane and put the genetic material in it. Like, are those better explanations than anything that the naturalist has on offer? I think that's the real question. Because if the answer is no, then it doesn't really matter how much we know from a naturalistic point of view. The theist doesn't have anything superior to say.
Well, of course, I'm not saying that for every unknown, we should stick God as the answer.
Yeah.
But it certainly does seem that for like the numerous paradoxes and like issues, that in this case, God is a better explanation, right? Because, of course, if there's seem to be many things that need to be part of the cell immediately, that natural processes, it seems highly unlikely, if not impossible, to achieve by any known like process. So like, to me, the answer God did it is a good answer, right?
Okay, but that's what I don't understand, right? Because you started by saying we shouldn't just say God did it for every unknown, and then immediately after that you said because there are no known processes that could do it. It seems like God did it as the best explanation. Why should I not invoke that for any mystery?
Okay,
I don't know how this murder happened. Well, God must have killed him, or any other scientific mystery.
Okay, I think because you can look at the knowns. Like, we do know some things about physics, right? We know that, and we know some things about chemistry. Like, we know that these homochiral nucleotides don't form. They don't form by natural processes in chemistry. Right. So it's kind of, since we know that they don't, and we haven't been able, no matter how hard we've tried, to achieve that, then it seems like at some point we should rule out the natural process.
Okay, why don't we take that as an example, right?
Okay.
So chirality refers to the observation that many biomolecules are handed, right? So like I have a left hand and a right hand, and they're not mirror images of each other. Likewise, I'm just explaining for everyone, right? Likewise, many biomolecules have a sort of handedness to them. And what we find is that in nature, for example, amino acids, I actually forget, are they all left-handed or right-handed? I never remember which way it is.
I think
but they're all,
yeah,
that sounds right, left-handed. Yeah, so they're all of the sort of same the same mirror image version. Whereas many, and the reason that's surprising is, first of all, it's not clear why that should be the case, sort of a priori. But also most, or at least many chemical reactions, I think most chemical reactions are not specific to producing one chirality or the other. The enzymes that we have in our bodies are all specific to producing left-handed amino acids or involving left-handed amino acids. But like in general, for chemistry generally, that's not necessarily true. So sort of the question is, how did this come about in the first place, and why did it come about? So they discuss this in chapter 8, right? Homochirality of building blocks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, left-handed. That's right. They do say that here. And what they point out is that this is still an unknown, an unresolved question, right? We don't know why, all amino acids in living organisms are left-handed. But it doesn't. It's not true that we don't have any ideas about why that might be the case. It's just that there's no overall sort of consensus view that's been developed, right? So in this chapter, they discuss a number of postulates that have been made, or a number of suggestions that have been made. There are certain reactions that produce excess of one chirality over the other, and I don't know if it's discussed in this chapter, but it's also known that certain clay minerals can also catalyze the formation of chemicals that are of particular chirality, and that's one thing that's clay minerals are actually thought to be possibly very important in the origin of life, because they're thought to have also been a catalyst for the production of polymers as well. I'm pretty sure that's discussed in one of these chapters, but I forget which one. If you look up there's a Wikipedia page on chirality where it discusses this, and there's quite a number of mechanisms that are discussed. I'm not a biochemist. I've done a little bit of biochemical research, but I'm no expert on these sorts of things. Homochirality. The page is called Homochirality. And there are quite a number of mechanisms that are discussed here, right? Now, I don't know which of them or which combination of them is most likely to have been, or if any, is most likely to have been the origin of homochirality in the origin of life. But what I think we can't say is that we know that it's impossible for homochirality to emerge. There are ways for it to emerge. We don't know how specifically it emerged, but it's just not true to say that it's impossible to emerge through natural processes.
Well,
now,
but can we say though that we have not observed it through natural processes?
Seen it. We haven't seen it in the context of the origin of life, because we haven't produced life from non-living organisms or from non-living matter, rather, as the book points out. Now, I don't know why we would expect that, because the conditions for it, we don't know what the conditions were, and it's not clear that we could produce them, even if we did. My best bet, based on what I've read, is that life emerged at the surface of underwater volcanic vents, where there was energy provided from the volcanic vents, and the clay minerals surrounding it could serve as a space for concentration of early monomers, and also a surface for catalysis of those into polymers. And there's been quite a lot of discussion of this hypothesis. That's my best guess, right? But we don't know that, and so the fact that we don't know what the conditions were, plus it's unclear whether we could create them, plus it almost certainly took millions of years, if not maybe tens of millions of years. It's not clear we could create that in a lab easily. Maybe we will one day. But anyway, so the fact that we haven't shown that in this particular way, I don't think should be too surprising. But the broader question is, have we been able to create chiral, like homochiral compounds? I mean, yes, we can, right? There are certain reactions in which that happens naturally. As I said, there are clay minerals that are known to catalyze particular chirality. We just don't know which of these mechanisms, or maybe even others that we haven't discovered yet, were relevant in the early evolution of life, like the chemical evolution of life. And just to follow that through, now, what's the competing explanation? Well, I guess God could create homochiral solution if he wanted to. Why would he want to do that? Like, there's no clear reason. I guess we just sort of stipulate that God likes left-handed amino acids. Like, to me, that's not a good explanation. So I don't see how the theist has anything better to offer than what the naturalist has to say, which is, well, there's certain processes that we know about. Maybe some combination of these was at work, or something else. We're still investigating it. The alternative is God likes left-handed amino acids. I don't. Do you think that's a better explanation?
Well, I don't think that we need, that would be like kind of outside the realm of science. Then we're talking about what's in
I know
God's
it's
mind.
not a scientific
So,
explanation, right? But I just mean as an explanation.
Well, I don't think it's a better explanation, but I think, you know, when we're talking about, like, I mean, it doesn't add any value to our observation of life, right? Like, if what we're trying to do with science is just know things about the world, right? So, it doesn't help us know anything to know where, like, what God's intention was about left-handed amino acids, unless he suddenly revealed that to us here, right? Like, but I don't understand why, like, that needs to be part of the discussion, right? I'm kind of like, well, we're looking for an explanation on the origin of life.
Mm-hmm.
So when we have exhausted the possibilities of life emerging by natural processes because it becomes too implausible, then at what point do you think it could become possible for God did it to be a better explanation?
At the point where it becomes less plausible for any naturalistic hypothesis, right? And of course, we have to have a way of assessing plausibility there. But this is what I keep saying. There is no demonstration that it's impossible for, let's focus on homochirality just to keep it focused, right? There's no demonstration that that's impossible. We just don't know how it happened, but we know that there are ways that it can happen. There's spontaneous symmetry breaking. There's certain reactions that do produce chiral mixtures, homochiral mixtures. There's also the clay minerals that I mentioned. I'm probably forgetting some other ones, but the point is that there are ways to produce chiral solutions, right? We don't know which of them occurred in the particular context. I mean, they discuss this in their chapter, right? They discuss a number of experiments that have been performed, and they just kind of say, yeah, well, we don't know if these conditions were present, or it wasn't enough chiral, things like this. It's like, well, yeah, because we don't have a full explanation. But we're very far from a proof that it can't happen. In fact, we have many, I guess, pieces of plausibility, like, well, here's a mechanism that could have been involved and things like that, right? Based on that, I regard the plausibility that some combination of these mechanisms or similar mechanisms could have resulted in left-handed amino acids as pretty high, right? We actually have quite a few pieces here, again, which they discuss in their own book. They just kind of poo-poo them as being insufficient. But so on that basis, I rate the plausibility under naturalism of say left-handed amino acids as reasonably high. Now, then I look at the plausibility. Okay, maybe the theists have a better explanation, right? Because the naturalists don't have a great explanation. It's kind of piecemeal and incomplete. But on the other hand, the theists have nothing, as far as I'm concerned. And so I'm not at the point where I'm going to say the theists have a better explanation. What I would need to see is that they have something better to offer. Because unless you can prove that something is impossible, it's not ruled out, right? Maybe it's implausible, but that's still not ruled out, because the other thing could be even less plausible. And this is the point where, I mean, maybe we just disagree on this point, right? But to say that, well, we've ruled out the naturalistic explanation, so therefore any divine explanation is going to be better, it just doesn't follow, because you haven't actually ruled it out. Well, I say you, but like the authors of the book haven't ruled it out. They don't rule out anything. All that they show is that things are implausible. Even the calculations they do about combining monomers into a polymer, right, where they just assume that it's entirely chance ordering, and they get very tiny probabilities of, I don't know, 10 to the negative 200 or something. Even that is not ruling it out, right? That's just saying it's overwhelmingly unlikely. Now, if it were the case that a divine explanation is even worse than that, then I would still accept the 10 to the minus 200, right? If the divine explanation is even, I'm not saying I accept that calculation, right? But just as an illustration, even if you get extremely low probabilities under naturalism, unless the theist can show that they could do better than that, then I would still accept the very low probabilities.
Okay, is there anything that you would rule out as like as something that could arise by natural processes? Like, if I said, if I told you my car arose by nothing but natural processes, would you rule out that? Would you say that is too implausible, or would you still hold the door open that that was plausible?
I mean, well, in some sense, I think that the car did arise through natural processes, but you mean through non-intentional processes, like
Yes.
yeah. So the thing about cars is that we know where they come from, right? So I mean, I would rule that out, right? Because I already have knowledge that precludes that.
Okay, but if I said no, my car, look, okay, let's give a machine that's similar to a car that no one has ever seen, that you didn't.
Well, so
know
maybe if we
the
found
origin
one on Mars, right? Like maybe that would be a better comparison.
of. Okay.
Yeah, because anything we find on Earth, obviously, we kind of presumably know where it goes. But yeah, like so suppose we found some advanced machinery on Mars that's clearly not one of our probes or something. And then yeah, okay, right. So I think that's better. So there are instances where we're not machinery, but we thought with, like, the face on Mars is a famous example of that's just pareidolia, right? But there are other cases where people have postulated, like, oh, this particular pattern on rocks or something might be man-made, but it's found that there's some naturalistic process for that, right? So we'd have to be sure that none of those that no naturalistic process could provide a plausible explanation, because sometimes it can surprise us. But let's suppose we're talking about
a sophisticated machine.
Yeah, a sophisticated machine, which, yeah. So in that case, I would be happy to say that, yeah, that's not something that can arise through non-intentional processes. So then the competing explanations would immediately arise about probably some alien race constructed this artifact and put it there at some point in the past. That would probably be the most plausible explanation. So I think there are... Yeah, go ahead.
I think the point of the book is that life is so sophisticated, even in its most simple forms, that we're talking about machinery that is more sophisticated than we've ever created. And so on that basis, we're ruling out the possibility that could come about by natural processes. And that seems like a natural thing to conclude.
Can you still... Oh, yeah, you just cut out for a second.
Yeah.
Yeah, so... suppose that we somehow, because if we found a sophisticated artifact on Mars, like a sophisticated piece of machinery, my reaction would be to postulate that some alien species made that. But suppose for whatever reason we can't go down that road. So if I was faced with the two explanations of it arose through non-intentional natural processes, or God just made it and put it there, I'm honestly not sure which one I'd go for. I'd have to think about that. I think it would depend on the case. Basically, because they're both such terrible explanations, right? On the one hand, natural processes involving some kind of sophisticated piece of machinery, like an Earth technological artifact, that doesn't really seem to be the sort of thing that happens. But I don't know. Maybe we misunderstand. I mean, as you point out, naturalists like me do believe that nature can evolve sophisticated machinery. It doesn't look like our machinery. Like it's different. So there's certain things that you would expect and certain things that you wouldn't expect. But maybe there's something weird there. On the other hand, God just making a sophisticated artifact and putting it on Mars for us to find, that's pretty weird. Like I have no idea why he would do that. It doesn't fit in with any explanation. So they're both terrible explanations. So I'd have to think long and hard about which I would go for. And so that's why I said, well, aliens, I think, are a better explanation than either of those, right? So
do you think
the
aliens...
point here is that sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, no. So I'm just saying that at that point, when both explanations are so poor, it's actually pretty hard for me to say which I would go with. And probably I would just remain agnostic until we could get more information. I don't think I'd have any particular strong beliefs about that. I wouldn't regard that as evidence for the existence of God, for example, if we found some sort of sophisticated artifact on Mars that we couldn't otherwise explain. Likewise, again, I think that this book overstates the degree of mystery about the origin of life. And we could talk about more specifics if you like. But even so, I think that it's not clear that they show that God is a superior explanation. So at best, what they might show is that we should just remain in a state of sort of confusion and withhold judgment about how it happened. Like I would probably withhold judgment about the strange artifact on Mars, absent a sort of alien explanation, which is probably what I would lean towards.
Okay. So, but what would be the reason that if you saw a sophisticated machinery on Mars, what would be the reason that you would like choose the alien explanation over the natural processes explanation?
Yeah, well, that's going to depend on specifics of the case, like exactly what we find. But the general idea is that we know that humans, I mean, it's a combination of background knowledge and plausibility assessments that I would make, right? So we know that humans make these sophisticated pieces of machinery once we reach a certain level of technology. We know that there are many other planets, well, solar systems and planets in the galaxy, and along that they've existed for a long time. We don't know how many of them um, may harbor alien civilizations, but it's at least plausible given our background knowledge. And I tend to think that there may be quite a number of alien civilizations. But even if there's only a few, or indeed even if they come from other galaxies, that's still plausible given our background knowledge because of how old the universe is. So all we have to postulate is that there are alien civilizations that arose on other planets, and that they came over here for exploration. Exactly why they would leave an artifact on Mars is slightly unclear, but it's at least sort of plausible given that story, right? I mean, we leave artifacts on other planets after all. So there's a story to tell there that's not wholly implausible given background assumptions. There are assumptions that need to be made here, so it's not a great explanation, but I don't think it's immensely implausible. Whereas it's not really clear what comparable explanatory story you'd tell, either under the non-intentional naturalistic explanation or under the sort of theistic explanation. Maybe one could come up with something, but at that case, then we would compare the explanatory models or the stories that we tell and assess them on the basis of our background assumptions. So, for example, if we thought that it was almost impossible that there was any other alien civilization in the universe, then the plausibility of that explanation would go way down, right? But I don't hold that view. I think that it's actually fairly plausible that there are technologically sophisticated aliens somewhere. And therefore, I would raise the plausibility of that as an explanatory postulate. If, for example, if by contrast you thought that there was some particular theological reason for why God would put an artifact on Mars, then maybe that would raise your plausibility of the divine explanation there. But then, of course, you'd have to assess the plausibility of that theological argument.
But if you recognized that something on Mars was something that must have been put there by an alien race, would you need to know anything about who those aliens were or why did it? Or would you would know that it was done, but you wouldn't know any more about it?
I think it depends a bit so I would phrase it slightly differently. You would need to postulate that the aliens had the technology to make that artifact and had a
Right.
reason or a situation in which that was left there. Now, you wouldn't need to know that, but you could postulate it, right? The question would be, because you're postulating this as an explanation for the artifact. So the question is, how plausible is that postulate? And I would say it's not horrendously implausible. It's not extremely implausible. Why? Well, because as I've just argued, we know that there are many solar systems in the galaxy, and there are many galaxies in the universe. The universe is very old, so there is time for them to travel here. We know that humans explore other planets to gain data and so forth. So it's not implausible, perhaps, that another species would have reason to explore. And then there are many reasons why you might come to leave a probe on a planet if it malfunctioned or it reached the end of its life. Or there was some strife back home. Again, these are plausibilities drawn from what we know about how things work in a human civilization. And I think it's not unreasonable to postulate that similar processes would occur. So the point is, we don't need to know. We can postulate based on background knowledge that we do have, and then make, I think, not wholly unreasonable assumptions. Now, they're still speculative, which is why it's not a great explanation, but I don't think it's entirely unreasonable. And the contrast I would draw is in the case of God, it's not clear what resources we have to make any postulates about what God would do, because God is not, a physical embodied technological species on a planet, which we
Right.
are, and by postulate the aliens would be. He's wholly different from us, other than, I guess, being a mind in some sense. And so I think that we're in a much worse position to make these sort of postulates about what's sometimes called divine psychology, or about what God would or would not do. And that's one of the reasons I'm very skeptical about theistic explanations, is it's not clear on what basis we postulate divine motivations or actions. Whereas I think we do have some resources for doing that for, say, alien civilizations, because there are things that they would share in common with us.
Yeah, well, I think if, we may not have scientific resources, but we do have revelation. So, we can
Yeah,
seek,
yeah. Yeah, of course. So if you have revelation about God's nature, then you can appeal to that. Of course, the question is, how do you know that revelation is about God? So then we assess that, right? But putting that question to the side, yes, you can assess God's actions or character on the basis of revelation if you accept that as veridical. So yeah, but that's why I was saying before, it becomes a question about what resources you have available to appeal to. So when it comes to assessing the actions that an alien civilization would take, I have available knowledge that we have about the cosmos, as well as knowledge about human civilizations and plausible things that would exist, processes that would exist in other civilizations. Like any technological civilization almost certainly has some degree of interest in exploration, right? Otherwise, how do you find new things and how do you expand, right? So and how do you learn the knowledge that you got to make the technology? So it's not unreasonable that an alien civilization would want to explore. So that's how I postulate that. But then you could likewise make similar postulates about, well, God has this certain characteristic or desire or attribute on the basis of revelation, therefore he would be likely to do this. So the question then becomes, how plausible are the postulates and how well do you get from those to the particular thing that we're trying to explain? And I think that in the case of the origin of life, it's actually very unclear how you go from even the standard sort of revealed characteristics of God to any of the particulars, like the chapters in the book that they try to use God as an explanation for it. It's extremely unclear what any of God's characteristics have to do with that. And so that's one of the reasons why I think that their explanation is just not a good one.
Yeah. Well, do you have answers about how these problems that they, talk about in the book? I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can always hear you. It's just
okay.
Weird.
So, when they're talking about the difficulties of the origin of life, so do you have responses to the different stair steps? Like, do you have plausible explanations for how these problems could be overcome?
Yeah, so I did a podcast episode on the origin of life like over 10 years ago now, which was quite interesting because I was able to spend some time looking into this stuff and reading through the book. This book I also dipped a bit back into some of the literature. I think so. Anything I say is speculative, right? Because I mean, the best answer is that these are active areas of scientific investigation, and we don't really know. But I think that in order to answer the charge that we have no idea about how to address these questions, I think that we can say some sensible things, right? So we talked about homochirality, and I mentioned a number of aspects there. In fact, many of these chapters, not quite all of them, but I think most of them, they provide, which is one good thing about the book, they provide references and citations in the chapters. Some of them not as many as I would like, but they basically offer some of the research that's being conducted, and they just sort of say it's not good enough, but they don't really provide what criteria we would expect, right? So maybe if we look at the example of where is it? Just trying to find the chapter, the one where they talk about the it's not linking. Yeah, so life is made out of what they call building blocks, or what we can call monomers, or it's like relatively simple molecules, like individual amino acids, for example. And these amino acids need to link together into longer chains to form functional units like proteins. And so there's an issue of how you get the monomers to link up in the right order to form a functional unit, because if they link up in the wrong order, then it won't do the job that it needs to. Now, in existing life, that process is carried out through the genetic code. That's what our DNA does effectively. It contains the information that tells the cellular machinery how to construct proteins by putting the amino acids in the correct order. But obviously, the very proto cells didn't have that, right? So the question is, or at least if we go far back enough, that didn't exist. So how did that arise in the first place? Now, one naive calculation is that, well, you just take however many building blocks you would have needed for the most basic self-replicating molecules. So there's a type of molecule called a ribozyme, which I think they discuss, which are RNA molecules that are able to at least partially self-catalyze. I'm not entirely sure exactly what the latest state of the literature is, because they keep discovering new ones. I don't think there's been a ribosome discovered that can fully catalyze its own replication. I think that some of them need like a pair molecule, or they can catalyze like half of themselves or something like that. But anyway, the point is, if you say, look, what's the smallest unit that can self-replicate, and then how did that form originally, like before it existed to replicate itself, right? So I don't remember the exact length, but it's something like 1 to 200 monomers in length, right? Now, so the naive calculation that I sort of mentioned before is that, well, you just calculate the number of possibilities of ordering like 100 amino acids or nucleic acids in length, right? And so that's approximately like 10 to the power of minus 200. Well, minus 2, that's the probability, 10 to the power of 200, or minus 200 for the probability that would happen on any one trial. But that's assuming that the problem with that calculation is that it assumes that you just have one meaning and then another one meaning that, right? So the more plausible postulate, which it seems to be the leading hypothesis at the moment, is what you would have is smaller, more internally stable like subcomponents of that, like a unit of 10 or 20, which come together, and then you combine those in different orders, right? So this would be like different domains or something of the of the protein, or of the RNA, depending on which we're talking about. So the point is that you don't need to assume this naive calculation of just calculate the total number of possible combinations of 100 or however many individual subunits. More realistically, you would assume that smaller segments come together first, and then those recombine in different ways. Now, there's still going to be an element of chance there, but I don't think any naturalist is going to say that it happened on the first try, in a sense, right? All you need to do is provide a mechanism by which the time available for the formation to happen is sufficient for the number of sort of combinations that were possible. So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, but added to that, you're not just having, that trial and error going on. You've got to have a membrane that comes together that's, semi-permeable, allows,
yes.
And, so in our simplest life form, it's got tons of different like gatekeepers that allow certain things in and don't allow other things in. It's got a way to harness energy. And if you're going to have these, proteins and everything, then you've got to have something for that. You've got to have not only the things linking together, right? The amino acids linking together, you also have to have the information in the DNA. So where does that come from?
So that was what I was just explaining. If we take the RNA world hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that the very first life essentially, or proto-life, contained its genetic information in the form of RNA, so we and all life currently, I guess, apart from maybe certain viruses, contains genetic information in the form of DNA, which is more stable, but it's also kind of it's less plausible for various reasons that was the original carrier of life. So the RNA world hypothesis is the hypothesis that the very first proto-organisms used RNA, and that sort of then later evolved to sort of reverse transcribe its genetic information into DNA. So the question of where the information comes in the form of RNA becomes the question of, if we assume that the first form of proto-life was some type of ribosome, so essentially that is an RNA enzyme that is able to catalyze the copying of itself, or portions of itself at least, then the question is where the information comes from is simply the question as to how did that original ribosome form. Because once it's formed, it's able to, and as long as it has building blocks, of course, and there are other things that it requires. But once it's formed, it is able to replicate copies of itself. And so that information is propagated on. So the information can initially arise through random processes, as long as we have, as long as the sort of time and space for those are sufficient for the chances, right? So if you just calculate the naive possibilities of, 10 to the power of 100 or 150 for however long it is, then that does begin to look a bit implausible. But if you consider that it's likely that smaller subregions came together first, and then those recombined in different ways, then I think that it's not implausible. The point is, we don't know what the right calculation is to make. I can't tell you what the odds are, but what I would say is that the naive calculations that you see made in books like this are not plausible. There's no reason why you would calculate it that way, other than that's just the most straightforward, naive way. Just like assume that they all came together through chance, like one at a time. But we don't have to assume that, and I don't think that's the most reasonable thing to assume. As long as you have the chances are sufficient, then the initial molecule or small population of molecules could have come about by chance in the right environment, and then they are able to copy themselves, which propagates that genetic information over time. So that's, in a sense, the origin of information. Now, you raised a number of other important questions, which are discussed in the book, right, as different steps, right? And all of these need to be investigated separately, right, which is why there's like different little literatures on each of them. So one is like, well, you have to enclose these biomolecules in some sort of space, right, because otherwise they'll just sort of diffuse apart. That's one of the reasons why it's thought that the earliest forms of proto-life arose around clay minerals, because the clay minerals can form pockets in which these molecules are concentrated. So you have a concentration of these monomers in these relatively small regions. And you can actually also, certain clay minerals are known to be able to catalyze polymerization. And so the clay mineral can serve both as a source of concentrating the building blocks and to help catalyze them into longer chains. The clay mineral surface can then also form a kind of structure around which a lipid membrane forms, because we know that in various experiments that have been done, you can form many of the basic building blocks through spontaneous chemical processes. Of course, there's questions about the exact chemical environment. But basically, once those are formed, we know that lipid molecules will spontaneously form like micelle structures, so that because that's the lowest energy, they sort of form a circle, just like you sort of have water droplets will spontaneously sort of form spherical-ish structures. It's sort of similar for lipids, right? So if they have a sort of a pocket of the inside of a clay mineral structure, then it's plausible that they will spontaneously form a membrane structure kind of around that, which then can be released and form the basis of a protocell, where you have essentially a ribozyme contained inside of a simple lipid membrane structure. And it's thought that this probably occurred around, as I said, volcanic events, because they can serve as a source of energy. There's an interesting paper that I was looking at that discusses this, how you can have a proton gradient across the little pocket of the clay mineral, which serves as a source of energy for these protocells. So then there's further questions about chirality, which we sort of already talked about. So to me, this picture is still highly speculative, right? Which is what the book points out, right? Because all of these processes have kind of been observed in part. Like, we haven't observed a full self-copying ribozyme. We haven't observed these minerals fully catalyzing like in the same environment. Like it's all partial and incomplete. But I don't see any possibility here. I don't see any impossibility here. To me, it seems like a plausible sketch of a picture.
Okay. Well, I guess, if we're imagining life as something very, very different than what it is today.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, that's what do you think?
I should have explained that.
What do you think would qualify as life? Like what is the definition of life?
Yeah. So that's a very good point, right? I should have mentioned this before. So, and I think the book is varied on this. Sometimes they sort of acknowledge this and sometimes they don't. So I feel like sometimes I feel like you could make a similar argument about human technology, which would be something like, look, it's impossible to make an automobile, right? Why? Well, because think about what you need to make an automobile. Maybe an automobile is not the best example. Maybe the best example would be like some sort of industrial machine. That's probably better, right? Because an industrial machine actually like is used to make other machines, which is sort of analogous to life, right? So currently we need life to make life. So the question is, where did it come from in the first place? Well, likewise, you can't make an industrial machine, right? Why? Well, because you need industrial machines to make it. You need a factory to make the machines to make another factory. So where did the first factory come from? Look at all the parts you need. You need like ball bearings, and you need advanced metallurgical practices, and you need the furnaces that can reach the high temperatures to smelt the steel that's in enough purity to make the furnaces. You need people who are highly skilled in doing this, but how do they get skilled in doing this if the machinery doesn't exist for them to practice on, right? So you can set up the same sort of complexity and interdependence, which we have in modern industrial machinery, industrial economies, right? And you can ask, well, how did this emerge in the first place? It's all interdependent. And the answer, of course, is that it emerged piece by piece, bit by bit, with one very crude tool being used to make a slightly less crude tool, and so forth, right? So, we make current industrial machinery using slightly inferior versions of the same industrial machinery, which were made using slightly inferior versions of those. And you could trace this back hundreds of years, right? So if you went back into even the Middle Ages, you couldn't, and even if you brought the blueprints, you couldn't make modern industrial components because they didn't have the technology to heat the steel hot enough, to machine things precisely enough, and so forth, right? So it's a bit silly to think that life would be any differently, right? To imagine that you could go from non-living chemicals to a modern cell, which is even like a bacterial cell, which is immensely complicated. That's a completely ridiculous idea. And if we somehow did have evidence of that, then I would say that is impossible through non-intentional naturalistic processes. But we don't have evidence of that. Unfortunately, the evolution of chemical evolution doesn't fossilize. So the very earliest forms of life that we do have evidence for are still something like bacteria, like very sophisticated. But the series of steps that we have sort of reconstructed and postulated, and there is still disagreement, right? But the current picture that we have is of beginning with very simple self-copying molecules, like the ribozyme in a simple membrane, right? That is a very long way away from current cells, which you identified, right? But then the idea is that from that, you can build up. So, for example, once you have a self-copying molecule, you can have chemical evolution take place where through mutations, it gradually acquires more capabilities, because in that instance, it's no longer an issue of pure chance. If there is a chance mutation that leads to a superior copy being produced, then it will copy more of itself, and so you get a proliferation of that in the population. So it will be selected for. So at this point, you've got a selection mechanism, and so some form of chemical natural selection can begin to exist. So over time, you will have the development of a more sophisticated ribozyme, which then at some point, this is not known when, was able to sort of reverse transcribe the information to DNA, and later on you have more different sequences. So let me explain it differently. Suppose you have a small sequence of DNA that codes for one gene, right? You can then have a duplication event, and we know gene duplication events are pretty common, right? So you have two copies of the gene. So one copy of the gene can keep doing the thing that it was doing before. The other copy can be subject to mutations that produce slightly different versions, which can then produce a protein that does something slightly different. So this is a very common mechanism of evolution, of evolution of life, where you have a duplication, and then one of the variants can then is able to be sort of selected for to do something different than the original one did, because now you have two, right? And that's one of the ways you can have this sort of accumulation of information, if you like, in the genome, where you have duplication and then mutation and then selection for advantageous mutants. And then that's how over time, again, presumably, this is speculative, but this is the general idea. This is how over time you have an increase in the quantity of information in the genome, with different products being selected to do different things. You have a process that was initially very inefficient, becomes more efficient by adding proteins that help it out. You have proteins that become studded in the membrane, and so on and so forth. And this process is thought to have taken, because I think the very oldest fossils, well, yeah, actually, I don't know, but this process could have easily taken hundreds of millions to like a billion years for the very earliest forms of proto-life to evolve into something approximating like a prokaryote today. So there's a long time for it to happen, and potentially a large areas for it to happen as well, once it becomes able to live in water near an energy source, like black smokers or volcanic vents initially. At some point later, life evolved the ability to photosynthesize, and that, of course, then produced greatly expanded its ability to harness energy and so forth. But anyway, yeah, so the point is that the very earliest life looked very little like current life, but just like the very earliest industrial machinery looked very little like current machinery. but is used to sort of iteratively build up to more and more sophisticated forms of machinery. Now, of course, the difference is that in the case of biological life, there was no, at least by my lights, there was no intentionality that was trying to make it increase in complexity. The mechanism was selection. But in a sense, that's similar to the mechanism for industrial machinery. It's just that the selection there is artificial. Humans select out the machines that sort of do the best, that serve their needs the best, the processes that work best, and they continue to use those. And those that are less effective, we stop using them. So there is some sort of comparison there. At least that helps me to think about the process of iterative complexity.
Right, but you can't select something if it's not already there. So, you've got to somehow get those component parts of the cell. And so, I mean, and granting that it would look very different than maybe even the most simple cell today, it still seems to me that the cell that you were describing, with just having maybe, RNA, just a ribozyme and, a lipid membrane, doesn't seem like it would qualify. Like, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't seem like it would be able. I mean, I'm just trying to imagine, how would this actually reproduce to, form other cells? Wouldn't it, if let's just suppose, and this is even speculative, that the RNA is, somehow catalyzing and, it's somehow, replicating. But then how would the cell itself replicate, and where would it harness the energy, and like, how do you envision that happening?
Yeah, so my understanding of the idea here is that so these like proto lipid membranes have a tendency to spontaneously fission if they reach a certain size. So they're sort of split up. So the idea is that you have an accumulation of again, I'm presuming this is happening in a sort of pockets of clay minerals surrounding volcanic vents. So that's the source of energy. There is a production. We haven't really talked about the production of monomers, but that's actually like the initial amino acids. That is thought to be the most plausible step, because we have actually been able to reproduce that in a laboratory environment, with the caveat that we don't know the exact environment of the early Earth, and they do talk about this in the book. But I do regard that as one of the more plausible components that we have. So if we assume that there's a mechanism for production of individual amino acids, and that this occurs in the environment of the volcanic vents, and these become concentrated in these sort of protomembrane structures, because essentially the lipid molecules are also being spontaneously produced. They spontaneously, which we know is energetically favorable, form these membrane compounds, which then also contain a certain number of amino acids. As these grow over time, what happens is that they'll spontaneously fission into smaller units. And if you have inside of those a ribozyme, I guess I was saying amino acids, but it should actually be nucleic acids if it's a ribozyme. So I'm mixing it up a bit. But parenthetically, there are some people who think that proteins came before RNA. So we don't actually know which came first. But why don't we just stick with the RNA world hypothesis just for simplicity, right? So we've got a membrane that's got a bunch of nucleic acids in it, which are formed spontaneously from the external input of energy. And we have a ribozyme. So that ribozyme is able to use those nucleic acids to form a copy of itself, and presumably multiple copies. As this sort of protocell gets larger through the accumulation of material, eventually it fissions into two, and you have sort of two protocells, and then that process continues. So this then, the idea is that this process would happen for probably millions of years, right? And over that time, there are mutations that emerge, and those that allow the cell to more effective, or the protocell to more effectively produce copies of the ribozyme, then proliferate, that they produce more copies and therefore become more dominant in the population. So there's a selection effect. So that's how you get the initial stages going. And then, as I said, later on, you can have like gene duplicate or protogene duplication events, which increase the amount of information present, which you can then select on. And so you can have different copies then doing different things. And so the idea is, again, that you will, just like a factory, where initially you'll have one thing done, and then you'll sort of add a component that helps it to do something that it was already doing. just like on my computer, right? I think the development of computer code is another way to think about this, because back in the day, people used to write computer codes by like manually plugging in the transistors to each other, and then we developed a means to kind of automate that by writing code like on punch cards, which you then sort of stuck in, and it would that would allow the sort of system to manually sort of rewire itself, so to speak. And then, but that was still coding like directly on the machine in terms of zeros and ones. And then we developed a method to automate that process a bit more by using like combinations of zeros and ones in a human readable way. And then we developed more high level programming languages like C. And then we developed even higher level programming languages, kind of bundled up commands together, and like Python, which enabled to do things faster. And then we wrote operating systems, right? And then we wrote browsers on those operating systems. And so we can like have this conversation, which is running on a browser, which is running on an operating system, which is running on like the underlying, which is written in a like high level programming language, is running on the underlying machine code. Like, so the point is that there's these layers of complexity. And then if you just ask like, well, how do you program a computer that's this complicated just using zeros and ones? Well, the answer is you can't, right? You don't start at that level. It's an iterative process. Now, of course, humans built machines to serve a particular purpose, but the idea here is that the selection mechanism of natural selection is providing the analogous mechanism for choosing sort of which I say choosing, but in analogous terms, which of the forms of life or proto-life end up predominating in a population, because those that are more effective at reproducing tend to dominate the population. So again, the iterative complexity, I think, is key to understanding this, right? It doesn't happen all at once.
Right, but it's very difficult to imagine. Okay, let's talk about the harnessing energy, because you were talking about how in the hydrothermal vents, there's this potential for gradients to occur, and that maybe that is how the first life harnessed energy and stuff. But life today uses ATP synthase, right? And ATP. And so there's the chicken and egg problem with that, which, how did the ATP synthase get formed, which needs ATP and many proteins in order to form? But, it itself is what's charging the ATP. Right?
How do we make modern machines that require machines to, like, it's the same question, right?
But yeah, except that, we're talking, your only mechanism available to you is selection. And so if these proton gradient, if this gradient in the hydrothermal vents was how the cell was originally harnessing energy, where do we ever make the jump to ATP synthase? Like, how does that ever get selected when if there's already this mechanism happening in the hydrothermal vents?
But it's exactly the same answer in principle as to how humans select for better technologies, right? So you have a technology that's making a machine, and then it's like, I don't know. That seems to be the same question. Like, well, how do we get a better technology when we already have a technology that does it? Well, you make one that does it slightly better.
But you have
likewise,
agents.
Natural selection selects. No, but it's the same. Agents perform the same function. Agents perform the same function of selecting out improvements as does the selection mechanism in evolution. And this is the key insight, I should say, of natural selection. And this is the key insight, right? So if I have a protocell that's harnessing energy through a proton gradient, which, by the way, one of the reasons we postulate that is because that is how ATP synthase still works. It produces a proton gradient over the internal membrane of the mitochondria, which right. is what it uses its source of energy for. So the idea is, well, if I'm a protocell that uses a proton gradient to extract energy, if I can somehow amplify that proton gradient, then that allows me, or reproduce that proton gradient to store energy for later, say, then that gives me an advantage. And so any proteins that I produce that allow me to do that give me a slight advantage. So I don't know exactly how ATP synthase evolved. There's probably literature on that, which I haven't read, so I can't explain that to you now. But the point is that we don't assume, no one thinks that these complicated multi-component enzymes just evolved in like one step or a couple of steps. What they evolved through, the processes that we postulate, is that they would have evolved through a stepwise process where initially you have, say, some sort of gene duplication event through a series of mutations. One of those, the products of one of those mutants, then is just by chance is able to slightly improve the functionality of the cell say in maintaining a proton gradient outside of an external source, for example. And then that provides it with a slight advantage. And then later you have another mutation, which allows that protein to work slightly more effective. And then that protein, those two proteins work slightly more effective. And then gradually you build up this complex. That actually makes a lot of sense of what we observe in biochemistry, which is basically it's a Rube Goldberg machine. It doesn't look like it's designed by an engineer who has a consistent vision. It's all sorts of things that are plugged together and like, well, this thing adds to this thing, which then adds to that thing. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is so complicated and bizarre that it works this way. But it's like things that evolve sort of backwards from the source. So one thing to add on to another thing, which adds on to another thing.
Right. But like considering that some of these proteins we're talking about are extremely sophisticated machines, like is it like reasonable to think that these assembled themselves when you wouldn't think that about a machine on Mars?
Oh, so no, now we're going back
Like
to Mars.
you
Well, I think the short answer is yes, right? We have overwhelming evidence that the life on Earth arose from a common ancestor. So that gives us good reason to think that that this process of well, let me phrase that differently. So once we get to the stage of having some kind of protocell, we have very strong evidence that this kind of molecular evolution can happen because of the common genetic inheritance of all forms of life. So I think that we have very strong evidence of that. And I mean, to an extent, we can produce that, right? Like we can artificially select for bacteria that are able to metabolize new forms of energy, for example. That's a famous series of experiments that have been done. So yeah, I think that there's very strong evidence that this form of like molecular evolution can happen, at least once you have some kind of protocell to work with. The most speculative stages are getting that in the first place, in my view. Yeah, because we have very strong evidence, even from the fossil record later on, but earlier on, just from the genetic evidence of the common ancestry of life, that this can happen.
Well, I don't know if we should open that can of worms because that's a long conversation. Because of course I disagree with you on that. I don't think we have.
I don't know why that's of course, right? Because that's an entirely separate question to the origin of life. Like you could think that life was produced through some sort of divine miracle, but also think that we share common descent. In fact, that would seem to make sense, right? Because otherwise you would think that there's multiple origins of life. And so the question about the origin of life doesn't even make sense. Like it's an entirely separate question. Because if God, well, I guess it could be like God guided the evolutionary process, but I don't know that that's what you think. So anyway, I don't know why.
I don't believe in evolution at all. Well, it depends how you define evolution. If you define it as change in organisms,
I'm talking about common descent.
I believe in it. But common ancestry, no, I don't accept that.
Well, so then the question of origin of life, you don't even think there was an origin of life. So why are we even talking about this? You think that God,
there was an origin of life.
No,
God created.
You believe in special creation of different kinds of life. So there was no one origin of life. So this whole question is moot because you don't even think it happened. So why are we even talking about this?
I know. And that's what the Stairway to Life is about. It's a reality check on where we think.
It's not about that at all, right? It's about explaining the origin of life. I don't know exactly what actually, I think at least one of the authors here may be a creationist because I was looking up what he's written elsewhere. But the thing is that if you believe in special creation, and by that I mean that different kinds of life were created by God in like separate creative events, even if they happen at the same time, that's not the point, but like they're created separately to each other, then there is no origin of life. There is no, because the traditionally origin of life question is phrased in terms of there was some what's called Luca, the last universal common ancestor, some kind of very early type of cell that was the ancestry of all subsequent life. And the question is, where did this come from? How did we get life from non-life? That's the question of abiogenesis, right? Now, if you don't even believe that there was a last universal common ancestor, if you believe that multiple forms of life were produced in an act of special creation in something alike, approximating their modern forms, then this entire question is just a non-question because it didn't even happen. It didn't even approximately happen. There was nothing like this that ever happened.
Yes.
So the whole question is entirely moot.
Yes, exactly. I mean, but it's a like, yeah, I don't believe life originated by natural processes, right? So, and so let me ask you this, James. Right now, do you think that my hypothesis is better supported because by scientific observations? Like I'm saying, life did not arise by natural processes, and then there's some who would say life arose by natural processes. Which one of those is better supported by our scientific observations today?
So let me just be clear. So there's three options here. Well, at least three options, right? One would be to say that the last universal common ancestor, like some sort of protocell, arose through non-intentional natural processes. Another possibility would be to say some sort of protocell ancestor of the last universal common ancestor arose through special creation, and then subsequently evolved into modern forms of life, or some approximations of modern forms of life were an act of special creation by God. So those are three possibilities, right? So essentially, it's like creationism, theistic evolution, and with divine creation, and then like naturalistic evolution, right? So those are like at least three options, right? So which one are you saying is?
Oh, creation. The special creation.
Special creation. Okay, yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think that it's almost impossible to reconcile that with modern scientific evidence. I mean, it does somewhat depend on whether you're a young or an old Earth creationist. Young Earth is even more difficult, but old Earth is still pretty much impossible on a biological point of view. Well, I mean, I say pretty much impossible. It is possible, but you have to assume that God basically did everything in a way to trick us to think that evolution by natural selection occurred.
I don't think so. I think that
I know you don't think so. But
that we come up with stupid ideas.
You asked me what I think, right? I'm not saying I'm not asking you to believe that based on my say so, but you asked me what I think. That's what I think. I think that it's almost impossible to special creation. Now, as to the question about the special creation of like something like the last universal common ancestor, that is possible, right? That's not ruled out by anything we know. I just don't think it's the best explanation. So I think that there are different levels here, right? Special creation is, I think, just pretty much completely ruled out at this point, unless you're willing to postulate like a deceptive God or something like that. Whereas I'm just telling you what I think. I'm just clarifying what I think about the different hypotheses. We could debate about it later, but at the moment I'm just clarifying. Right? Okay. Whereas as to like special creation of, say, a protocell or last universal common ancestor, I think that's consistent with what we know scientifically. It's just that I don't think it's a good explanation of the available facts. So I do think that these are in different epistemic states. That's my view. Now, if you'd like to then argue about that, I'd be happy to, but I just want to clarify what my view was to start with.
Yeah. Well, I'm surprised you didn't know you were coming on a channel of a crazy young Earth creationist. That's what I am. Maybe you wouldn't have come on if you knew I was a young Earth creationist.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I knew you were a young Earth creationist. I mean, I knew that you believed in a lot of things that I disagreed with, but I mean, maybe that came up and I just sort of forgot, right? But anyway. So I'm pretty sure I didn't know you were a young Earther. I thought you might have been an old Earth of some sort. But also different creationists have different, I don't know, they say different things, right? So exactly what they believe about the process varies. So I don't know. I don't think it's good to judge on the basis of a label.
Okay. Yeah.
So when you say young Earth, how young are we talking? Because that's another thing that varies.
Well, I don't know. But so like, and when people ask me how old is the Earth, I have to say I don't know. But if you're a young Earth creationist, you know something, right? Well, otherwise you wouldn't say young. Okay, I don't know by our like, I can't say there's a scientific, reason that I can say the Earth is such and such age. But the reason I believe the Earth is young is because I think the scientific evidence is mixed. Like there's some evidence against young Earth, there's some evidence for young Earth, and my theology is like better. I think the theology, if you believe in young Earth, is much easier. So like, for example, there's a genealogy in the Bible that basically tells us Adam to Jesus Christ. And so now the reason I say I don't know for sure, like if I base it on those genealogies, then yeah, the Earth is like 6,000 years old. But if you leave room in the genealogies for gaps, like when it says son of, and it's actually like the grandson of or the great grandson of, which is done sometimes in genealogies, then it can be older. So if I said the Earth is 1 billion years old, is that plausible under your view? Well, if we're talking about the globe itself, I'm okay with the globe being billions of years old. But the reason what other sense of Earth could I mean other than the globe? Well, that's what I mean by the Earth. Okay, I don't know of any other sense of the word the Earth. Okay. Yeah, so I'm okay with that. If you want to call me an old Earth creationist based on the fact that I'm okay if the globe is 1 billion years old, then fine. But I don't think the globe is 1 billion years old. So I think like the whole evolution thing, it all goes together because we start talking about layers of rocks and millions of years, and then, you know, fossils and blah, blah, blah. And so I think like the long ages kind of goes together with the evolution story, and it doesn't really fit the creation story.
There are so many interesting issues. So one thing I want to tease out the age first of all. So you don't think it's a billion. What about a million?
No.
What about 100,000?
Getting closer.
How old
getting closer.
You think the Earth is? That's all I'm trying to get at this point. What about 10,000?
Sorry. Well, I think there's, you know, some like reasons to believe it's not in the millions, right? Because the formations that we have, like the erosion rates that we track and things like that, I don't think this continent that I'm sitting on right now should be here at all if we go back millions of years.
I'm not even asking you to justify it. I'm just curious. I just want to get at how. So you think the Earth is like circa 10,000 years old?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yep.
But then there's another question. So you distinguish between the Earth and the globe. Like I legitimately don't know what you mean by that. Like what distinction are we drawing here?
Well, I guess because I'm drawing a distinction between the life on Earth. Okay.
Right. Okay.
So I think that's the big deal, because for me, you know, the Bible says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. So basically that could have been going on. Like there could have been a globe sitting there with an ocean for a couple billion years, and that's fine. But when I think once the creation week starts and God starts creating life, then there's no room for millions of years in there.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, from a scientific point of view, the first life began in the oceans, but there was also a time when the Earth didn't have. Yeah. So for most of its history, the Earth was not teeming with life. There might have been some bacteria and certain part or protobacteria along certain parts. But anyway, that's just an interesting parallel there. But okay. Yeah. So the Earth itself could be very old potentially, but the life is very recent. Okay, that's interesting. So from a scientific point of view, the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and we don't know how old life is. Life is probably, as far as you know, arose very soon after the Earth cooled down. So I think 3.8 billion years is a common figure, but that would just be sort of some sort of protobacterial life in certain regions. I think sort of large multicellular organisms didn't emerge for several billion years after that. So the Earth would have been pretty empty for most of its existence. And one interesting thing that I think a lot of people don't know is that animals actually evolved before plants. So for most of the history of the Earth, the surface would have been pretty barren, which is kind of depressing when I think about it, at least, to think of a barren Earth without like grass or trees on it. Anyways, so, but yeah, so okay, one thing I'm interested about is suppose that. I gotta be heck if I phrase this question. Do you think that the truth of Christianity is contingent on the truth of on a young Earth?
No, but I think the story is harder to like. You'd have to go very metaphorical, I think, with Genesis. I don't think the stories fit well together. But you know, if I found out evolution was true, I'd probably find a way to make it work with my faith, like a lot of people have. But my reasons for rejecting evolution are scientific. Like even if I wasn't a Christian, I would not believe in evolution. I would completely reject it on like scientific grounds.
That's an interesting claim. Yeah, I don't. Well, first of all, I don't know anyone who said that to me before, but also, least of all, people who I would necessarily believe. The trouble is because I'm not saying this is the case for you.
Yeah.
But there are other people who defend evolution who I don't trust intellectually. Who defend creation, I should say, who I don't trust intellectually, who will say things like that because it. Or they use that as a rhetorical flourish to emphasize how weak they think the scientific evidence for evolution is. But in fact, what they really want to do is just bolster or the real reason they hold these beliefs is because of pre-existing like theological commitments, which itself is actually okay. Like if you have overriding theological reasons to reject other evidence, then that could be, although I think you should be honest about that. But anyway, the point is that if people said that, I would not necessarily ordinarily believe them. I do believe you when you would say that, though. But what do you like? What is so? Let's put the theology aside completely, and just ask about evolution. By now, so here, let's talk about common descent, right? Let's be specific.
Okay.
So all life on Earth arose, or let's say developed from a last universal common ancestor, which I'll emphasize. The book that the Stairway to Life. That doesn't address this question at all. It's talking about how that original common ancestor occurred. Let's just suppose that there is one, like some sort of cell. Why do you think that the scientific evidence doesn't support evolution does not support common descent from that proto-organism?
Yeah, because I don't think there's a plausible mechanism. Like we have not shown a viable mechanism in order for that to happen. Okay. If you want to talk about selection, well, you've got to have something to select from. So you've got to have something that develops things in organisms. Right now, the proposed, mechanism is mutation, right? But mutation is, we see it being more degenerative than producing. Right. And even when it happens to produce something that may benefit the organism, we don't see it building new structures within organisms. And that's what we need. We need ridiculous amounts of building, right, for this whole thing to happen. And so we just don't observe that scientifically. Like we might observe some small changes that happen in organisms, but we don't see like a heart being built by mutations. We don't see, and of course the evolutionary answer to that is, well, but that takes lots of time. Of course we can't observe it. Well, how about if we figure out if it can actually happen before we build our whole like story about our origins based on it. So like, I just don't see mutation as a viable mechanism. So I don't see a viable mechanism for this entire story to happen.
So that's a very interesting answer to me. So let me ask you this question. Do we need to know how something happened? Like, as in, do we need to have a mechanism for it that we know to have a reasonable belief that it happened? For example, if I think the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, do I need to know how they built it in order to form a justified belief that they built it?
No.
So then why is I don't agree that we don't know a mechanism, but let's just accept that for the sake of argument, that we actually don't know a mechanism. Why do we need that to be justified in believing that there's life shared a common ancestor?
Well, everybody has a choice about what stories they believe. It's just, I don't like the story of evolution. I like my story better, which is God created. So unless I have a scientific reason to believe in the evolutionary story, I don't think I'm justified in believing it. I'm justified in believing the story that has touched my life, changed my life, given me great joy, given me connection with God. And so I have like no reason to discard that story in favor of a very implausible story, one that I think is, just not feasible. I have no reason to accept that other story.
So that answer doesn't make sense to me, because just only a few minutes ago we said, let's put theology out the window for a moment and just ask on the basis of the scientific evidence.
Right.
And then a couple of minutes later, you're bringing that in again.
Because you asked me how to form a justified belief, right? And so you asked about, can we form a justified belief about the Egyptians building the pyramids? And yes, because we have other archaeological evidence and things that would lead us to believe that, right?
Right.
But when we're talking about I'm telling you how I formed my belief about this story and how I rejected.
Yeah, but I think there's a point of confusion here, because what I'm interested in is not why you actually believe,
right?
Why you actually disbelieve in evolution, because you've just said that it relates to an alternative story that you accept. So that's fine. I don't really want to talk about that right now.
Yeah.
What I want to investigate is the claim that you made, which is that even if you didn't accept that alternative story, you would still disbelieve evolution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
So,
of the reasons I already
from common
gave you.
sense.
So I don't have
Yeah.
a reason to accept it on a scientific
Well,
basis.
hang on, right? So I'm trying to put the pieces together. Okay, so the claim is that when I asked you, so I didn't ask you why don't you believe in evolution. I asked why wouldn't you believe in evolution even if you didn't have Christianity, you didn't have God as an explanation, you didn't have any of that, right? So, and your answer was because there's no plausible mechanism, right?
Yeah.
So then I asked you, let's just accept that for the moment. Does one need a plausible mechanism in order to have a belief that something happened? And your answer was no. So then my question is, why is it that you wouldn't believe in universal common ancestry in the absence of God, even when the reason you gave for not believing in it doesn't seem like you need to have that thing? You gave the reason of mechanism, but then you also said you don't need to have a mechanism to believe something. So it doesn't seem like that would justify your claim.
Well, because I don't think we make every decision about what we believe based on scientific evidence. If it's
I never
on
said scientific evidence, right?
Yeah,
I never said
but
that.
then I think you have no justification to believe in evolution if you're going on scientific. If you're only looking at scientific evidence and you have no other agenda, no nothing, then you have absolutely no reason to accept evolution ever. It's completely
so the standard argument to accept evolution, to accept universal common descent, is that all life forms substantively share the same genetic code and large portions of their genome. That's the standard argument, right? That is by far and away best explained by them sharing a common ancestor, because that's exactly what you would expect under a common ancestor.
I don't think that's the best explanation.
Well, what's an alternative explanation?
It makes sense. Well, if you believe in special creation, then it makes
no.
sense.
We're putting that aside for the moment. I'm asking, even if you didn't accept God, you would not accept the evidence of shared genetic code and substantial shared genetic inheritance. And I'm asking, why is that not good reason to accept a universal common ancestor, even absent a mechanism for generating a mechanism? Because let's just assume that there's no mechanism, but we observe shared genetic code and substantially shared genetic heritage. That is, I think, very strong evidence for the universal ancestor. But you don't think it is, so I'm asking why not?
Well, because I think it can be just as easily explained if you have a different starting. I mean, but see, you're not letting my story come into it. So,
because you didn't let your story come into it by saying that even absent that story, you still wouldn't believe it. So I'm just holding you to what you said before. I don't think that's unreasonable.
Okay, all right. But if I'm just trying to figure out why, if I'm starting with a neutral, if I'm starting with, total neutrality, right? Mm-hmm. Why is the idea that organisms have some shared thing necessarily evidence of common ancestry? It could also be evidence that, hey, they eat the same food, they, use the same air. There could be another explanation for that that's just as plausible.
Those are terrible explanations, though. So we know that the food that an organism eats doesn't determine its... Well, first of all, organisms don't eat the same food. Some photosynthesize, some eat grass, some eat other organisms, but they all share a large proportion of their genetic inheritance, right? But also, the food that an organism eats doesn't determine its genetics. Its parents do, or its ancestor does, right? So the fact that we know that ancestors... the more, I mean, even in humans, right, but in other organisms as well, the more closely related they are, the more of their genetic material that they share. And so the explanation then is the reason that so many different organisms, even from like a banana to a human, share a large portion of their DNA, is because a long time in the past, they shared a common ancestor. Saying that they eat the same food doesn't even make sense, because plants don't even eat food. But also, we know that that's not where genetic inheritance comes from. There is no other explanation on the table that I am aware of anyone postulating that would explain so naturally why there's this shared inheritance. I mean, this is a very natural inference to make, right? If I find that I share genetic traits with someone, I'm like, oh, maybe we're related. We make inferences like that pretty readily, right? This is just an extrapolation of that. And so I don't see what the problem is here. At least that's prima facie evidence for common ancestry. It's not the only piece of evidence, but at least I would say that a neutral observer would say, that's pretty interesting, right? That they all share this genetic inheritance.
But aren't you starting with a story about the origins when you're doing that? Like, you're starting with the story about the common ancestry. So
I'm
you're
not
not
sure it
letting
matters which comes first, right? So the question is, does
Mhm.
the evidence support the story, or conversely, does the story or the model provide a good explanation of the evidence? And in virtue of that, we say we have reason to believe that the story is true because it would predict exactly this evidence, and this is in fact what we see. So in virtue of the story making sense, fitting with the available evidence, that's supportive of it. Because other possible explanations, such as, and in fact, this is what people thought. Sorry, my camera's gone again. Let me just get it back.
That's okay.
You see, it's fine for like an hour, and then it just dies. I don't understand it. But anyways, this is what people thought, that there might have been multiple origins of different forms of life. For example, plants and animals could have emerged separately. That's a possibility, and that's what people thought for some amount of time. But the fact that they share actually quite a lot of genetic material and also the genetic code is evidence that they actually shared an ancestor back in the past. That's not what you would predict, that they would share this genetic code if they emerge separately. So there are other stories that you can tell and people believed, but they don't predict the same evidence. And so I think that is good reason to accept the universal common ancestor.
But even if you have not been able to discover a possible pathway for all the diversity of life and the systems and things that are in each organism.
Sorry, you mean the mechanism for producing the different structures that we talked about before?
Right.
Well, but we talked about that, right? Because I don't think that you need to know how something happened in order to have a belief that it happened, as long as the evidence for it happening is good enough. So I don't think that we needed to. I mean, I think we have some ideas now, but we don't need to know how the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids in order to have a justified belief that they did build the pyramids. Likewise, I don't think we need to have a belief or knowledge of the mechanisms of evolution in order to have a justified belief, at least in universal common ancestry.
Okay. Well, I think,
and I'm not sure
case,
why you think we do, because you said in the pyramids case we don't.
Yeah, well, because I think the archaeological evidence is sufficient for me to have the justified.
But why is the archaeological evidence that the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, which, by the way, I have no idea why you accept as a young Earth creationist, but let's put that to the side, right? Because if you accept that evidence, I don't know why you would reject other forms of archaeological evidence, but that's just an aside, right? If you think that evidence is sufficient to establish that the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, then why is the evidence that I've offered of shared genetic code and the genetic code and genetic inheritance, why is that insufficient for establishing universal common ancestry? Like, what's wrong with that as evidence?
Well, it may be enough. It may be sufficient for you, but it's not sufficient for me to overcome the obstacles.
What obstacle?
Well, I mean,
I'm asking you to provide a rational, like an explanation for why that's not, because it seems prima facie that it's strong evidence. Many people take it to be evidence. You haven't even said that it isn't evidence. You're just saying that you don't find it convincing. To me, that's not really very compelling. This is like the atheist who, regardless of what argument is given for the existence of God, they're just like, I don't find that convincing. I don't think that's a sufficient response. You have to give a reasoned explanation as to why it's not a good argument. You can't just say, I don't like it.
Well, yeah, but I mean, and this very much ties in with, I don't think it's plausible that the origin of life occurred by natural processes. So therefore, I'm also more unlikely to think that all of life had a common ancestor. So, I mean, for you, that evidence may be enough to make it sufficient. But for me, there's too many other problems to make that evidence. And I do think, okay, that could be counted as good evidence if there were no other possibilities. And there are other possibilities.
You haven't actually offered any other possibilities, again,
because
inside
you're looking
the framework
for
we're
another
talking about.
Well, you're looking for another naturalistic possibility, and I can't give
I'm not,
you
right?
one.
All I'm asking for is for you to defend the claim that you made, which was that if you didn't believe in God, you would still not believe in universal common ancestry. So in defense of that claim, I think it's reasonable to ask for an alternative explanation for the facts that we have that would work under that framework. That doesn't have to be a naturalistic explanation. I didn't say anything of that. Maybe mischievous angels or mischievous demons or whatever made it in this way. Like, I don't know, that's possible. And so, like, I'm open to you saying any of those things. I'm just trying to understand the justification for the claim that you made, which you seem to make on the basis, like, to emphasize that you think the scientific evidence is for universal common ancestry is very weak. But in response, your main claim is just to say that you think that life emerging by natural processes is very implausible, but that's irrelevant, right? Because it might not have emerged from natural processes. The claim is simply that there is universal common that life on Earth shares a universal common ancestor. That universal common ancestor may or may not have emerged through natural processes. That's a separate question, right? And so it seems like that's changing the subject. All I'm asking is, do we have sufficient reason to think that there was life shared a universal common ancestor? I've offered you, I think, pretty convincing reasons, and honestly, reasons that have convinced many Christians, including very conservative Christians. So I think it's reasonable to say that it's good evidence, right? And your response is just kind of to say that you just don't find it convincing.
Well, but remember, I did give you a reason because I don't think there's a mechanism. And then you said, well, can we be justified? And I said, yes, you can be justified. You know,
I think that undercuts what you've said.
Okay. Well, but can't I be justified in one sense, like with the Egyptian pyramids, and not feel that I'm justified in this case because I don't think the evidence is
You
good
could, right?
enough?
But I do think that you need some sort of story to tell about when it's okay to believe something happened without needing a mechanism, and then when we need a mechanism. I feel like that there's an account owing there as to how you make the determination. Because otherwise, it seems a bit ad hoc that you've just accepted one and not accepted the other. Yes, there might be contextual factors that are relevant, but then I think we need an account of what those factors are.
Well, maybe your your standards are different than mine.
I don't feel like I'm asking for anything too outlandish. I'm just asking for an explanation as to why we can accept some things happen on the basis of not knowing how, and other things we can't. I think that's pretty reasonable for established. I think that having a consistent epistemology is very important, and by that I mean we apply consistent standards to evaluate claims. That's a way of avoiding bias and a way of avoiding error and confusions in our decision making. Not that it's perfect, of course, but that we sort of try to apply consistent standards. So I would like to say that the way I arrive at beliefs about history or science or, I don't know, economics or theological claims is through an analysis of the arguments and evidence using comparable processes that evaluate the strength of different arguments for and against. That's actually one of the reasons why I ask Christians or creationists or whoever exactly to explain why their proposed explanation for, say, the origin of life is superior to the one that they're critiquing, because I apply the same standard to both. I don't think it's satisfactory just to say, well, naturalism can't explain it, but theism sort of doesn't have to explain it. To me, that's not acceptable because if we're going to say that naturalism needs an explanation, then I think theism does as well, because I apply common epistemic standards. Now, I actually realize that not everyone does that. I know that people like William Lane Craig don't do that, because people like Craig are quite happy to say that a divine action is just by itself a sufficient explanation. We don't need to explain anything further. At least as far as I can tell, that's what he's happy with. Now, I don't regard that as satisfactory. I regard that as ad hoc or special pleading. But I mean, different people have different epistemic standards, I suppose. But to me, that's actually very important to apply consistent epistemic standards, because I think otherwise it's very easy for us to get to just be misled and to apply biases and distorted thinking. I'm not saying that necessarily is what's happening in your case. Obviously, I disagree with you, right? But I don't know. To me, the consistent standards thing is very important.
Well, James, now see, there was a time in this conversation, though, that I didn't feel like you were applying consistent standards. Because,
sure, when was that?
Well, when I gave the example of, okay, if we found, and you changed it to Mars, because I was using something on Earth, and you said, no, okay, let's move it to Mars. If I found machinery...
Well, I just thought that would make the story a bit easier.
Right, and it did. That was a good move. But you were immediately, you said, okay, if I saw machinery, sophisticated machinery on Mars, I would not think that it came about by natural processes. I would assume it was done by aliens, right? But when we talk about life, which is very sophisticated machinery, you were not willing to apply that same standard and say, okay, this sophisticated machinery of life cannot come about by natural processes. There's a better explanation, and that must involve an agent.
Oh, in the case of the machinery, I thought you were saying,
In the case of life, because life is full of sophisticated machinery, so it is comparable to finding machinery on Mars.
Right.
But
I see the analogy.
You were not willing to, you're not willing right now to say, okay, life cannot come about by natural processes. It must have had an agent.
Yeah, so I don't think that that's an inconsistent standard. So let me explain why I don't think that. So an epistemic standard is the way we evaluate evidence and assess whether something counts as evidence for or against something, and how we evaluate arguments, right? An epistemic standard isn't a particular type of explanation or like a particular appeal to a certain mechanism. So the fact that I'm willing to say that certain types of, let's call living organisms machinery for the sake of argument, right? The fact that I'm willing to say that certain types of machinery cannot come about through natural processes, whereas other types of machinery can, I don't think that's applying different standards. As long as I have some sort of reason to give that's consistent with my other epistemic commitments as to why I make that distinction, right? And I think that I offered that, right? What I would say is that we have good reasons to think that life. First of all, we have very good reasons, I think, to think that life emerged from a universal common ancestor. As to where that common ancestor emerged, that type of biological machinery, I think that we do have the sketch of a picture as to how that could happen. It's only an initial sketch, but I think that we have there's reasons to regard that as plausible. By contrast, I don't think we have similar reasons to regard some sort of like space probe. Let's say we find that on Mars to put some meat on what sort of machinery I'm talking about. We don't have similar reasons to think that that type of machinery could come about through natural processes. Of course, if we find out a mechanism that I didn't know about or find other reasons to think that it could, then I would change my mind. But from my understanding, there's no similar reasons to think that we could have a space probe-like object arise through natural processes. Of course, I can think of science fiction scenarios where that could occur. For example, perhaps it looks like metal, but it's actually not. It's some sort of organism that looks to us like a space probe. But let's just say we can rule that out through whatever means. And it's like, no, it's sort of like an artifact that's been machined, right? In that case, I would say it's not plausible to think that came about through non-intentional natural processes. However, there is an alternative explanation, which would be some sort of extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, you'll also bear in mind that I said, suppose we took extraterrestrial intelligence out of the equation and just had God versus non-intentional naturalistic processes, I would say at that point, I would just remain agnostic, because I don't think that either of those forms a good explanation. So I think that that's entirely consistent, right, with my epistemic commitments. Because let's take it back to then the case of the origin of like biological life on Earth. I think that there's what I said is the sketch of plausible mechanisms by which that could have occurred. To me, that pushes it quite a ways ahead of the God hypothesis. But suppose that I didn't have those, right? Suppose this book is completely accurate in its presentation of how implausible it was, right? At that point, I think I would just say, we don't know. I don't think I would say that that God's a better explanation, because I'm not convinced that any case has been made that God can explain anything about that. But maybe I would just say, look, they're both such lousy explanations that I should withhold judgment. So I think that I'm applying the same epistemic standard. Essentially, when there's nothing to distinguish between two explanations and they're both terrible, I will withhold judgment. When there's something to privilege one explanation over the other, even if it's still not great, I will prefer that explanation. And that's what I believe that I'm doing in the case of the origin of like biological machines on Earth. I think there are reasons to privilege that over the case of over alternative hypotheses, and so I privilege that. In the case of the machine on Mars, I would privilege the extraterrestrial, because I think that that's superior to the alternatives there.
Okay, so how is that different than what I'm doing with, the common ancestry and the evidence for common ancestry? I'm like, you didn't like it, and like, I feel like you wouldn't allow me to bring the origin of life into that, but you brought common ancestry into your origin of life scenario. So like, if you get to bring in if you get to bring in the common ancestry to support your origin of life, then why can't I bring in origin of life, the difficulties of it, to support to justify my non-belief in the common ancestry?
Well, yeah. So the origin of universal common ancestry is probably not that relevant to the origin of life. So I maybe shouldn't have mentioned it. I think the reason I mentioned it is because it does lend plausibility to certain mechanisms of like chemical evolution. I think the development of like protein systems over time. But you could argue that many of those are not, like, a lot of the processes of the origin of life are prior to even that, right? So I think that, I think that probably I would just not even appeal to that at all, and make things a bit simpler, right? But with respect to how it's different in your case, so I think in principle you could distinguish the pyramids case from the origin of life case and say, in one reason I have reason to favor the hypothesis, and the other I don't. I mean, that's not exactly what you said, right? But let's suppose that is what you wanted to affirm. But I think that then this is what I said before. The issue is, let's put some meat on the bones and ask, in virtue of what is the Egyptians built the pyramids a good explanation, but the shared DNA is not, in virtue of what is Egyptians built the pyramids the best explanation of the pyramids, whereas universal common ancestry is not the best explanation of, shared genetic heritage. And I don't feel like you really had much to say about that. I suppose, if I can steal man, it seems that what you're saying is that although we don't know how the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, the plausibility of that is at least not as low as the plausibility of evolution from of current forms of life from a universal common ancestor. And this is why I don't think you can appeal to the origin of life per se, because that step could be implausible, but the next step could be plausible, right? So what you would want to say is that evolution of the current diversity of life from a universal common ancestor, not from non-living, just from a universal common ancestor, that is extremely implausible given current knowledge, whereas Egyptians building the pyramids is maybe only somewhat implausible. It's not as implausible. And so that could be the reason why you're willing to infer that the Egyptians built the pyramids, even if you don't know how. But the diversity of life can't have arisen from, or probably didn't emerge from, a universal common ancestor. Likewise, even if we don't know how. Would that be what you would say? Or would you affirm that?
I'm kind of lost. Let me just do it myself. Let me just
Cool.
Look. And I do think the origin of life is relevant. And the reason is because if you cannot get life to arise by natural processes, and you're not starting with one common ancestor, like if you're not starting with one cell or whatever, then you're not starting with a common ancestor, right? Like you've common ancestry can be, I mean, like there's no reason to favor that over another explanation. So
but the issue is that in order to believe that, we just talked about this a while ago, in order to believe that current organisms share a common ancestor, you don't have to think that common ancestor came about through natural processes. Many Christians don't think that. And so I don't know why you then say that that's a problem for the hypothesis, because you don't have to think that common ancestor arose through natural processes. That's a separate question. You could think that the last universal common ancestor was a special creation and still believe that it was the last universal common ancestor.
Right. But I have another reason for thinking that the common ancestry evidence is not enough to justify my belief.
Yeah,
and
so
that is,
what is that?
There is no mechanism for it. There's no mechanism for the development of the variety of life that we see on Earth. And so
the reason that's not analogous to the pyramids case is,
and the reason is because I do think we have possibly more reasons to believe that the pyramids were built than we do for the non-mechanism is a bigger problem for this story than it is for the pyramids.
Okay, so I think that's essentially what I was saying. Maybe in not as clear a way as I'd hoped. Yeah, I think the problem with that argument is that then you need, well, I would argue one needs to articulate why it's so particular. Because let me rephrase it. It seems that you need a particularly low prior in this could have happened, right? In order to, if it's just like, well, it's not that we don't know, right? If the answer is just that we don't know how it happened, I don't think that's sufficient for your argument to work. In order for your argument to work, it seems that you would have to say, we don't know, and it's very unlikely.
See, and I would say claim. Very unlikely, and we have evidence to the contrary. So
evidence to the contrary of what? Evidence against the last universal common ancestor.
Well, we have
evidence against the mechanisms that it could have produced.
Like mechanisms are problematic. They show that actually evolution goes in the wrong direction. It's degenerative. And so, it's not just that we don't know the mechanism. Yep. It's that there's problems with getting it to go in the opposite direction.
Yeah, okay. I think I understand what you're saying now. And so I would actually suggest that saying the reason is that we don't know how is actually, I don't think that's actually your argument. Your argument is that what we do know about the relevant processes, it's very unlikely that it could have happened. And I think that's actually a substantively different argument, because one is appealing to ignorance, which I don't think works. The other is appealing to knowledge that we do have. Which, I mean, I disagree with the claims that you're making, but at least if those claims are true, then potentially that would work. So I don't know. I actually think that's a substantively different point.
Oh, wow. So we got somewhere.
I think we did get somewhere, yes.
Cool.
But that might be a point to leave that, because then talking about those specifics would take a very long time. But at least I kind of understand what you're saying now. Because I don't think I don't think the appeal to ignorance works, but the appeal to we know things that would render it implausible. I think structurally that works. I just would disagree with the premises you're going to appeal to there.
Right. Okay. I get that. And you know what, James, I would love to have a longer conversation with you about that sometime, because I want to talk about this, and I can hardly get anybody to talk about this with me. So people want to say, oh, you're stupid for not believing in evolution. You're just non-scientific, blah, 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 blah. But then they won't bring it. They will not bring it. Like, bring me the evidence then. Let's talk about it. But people never want to do that.
So I would say, if I was to have a longer conversation about this, that you'd probably be the first candidate to do that with, because I think you're far more reasonable and willing to listen than most people who defend creationism. But I mean, of course, there are people who critique it who are pretty unpleasant to talk to as well. But so one of my concerns, though, would be that not exactly concerns, that there is a lot of material available in print and online presenting creationist claims and also responding to those claims. So what I'd really like to do, what I think would be more useful for a future discussion, is to focus on, I don't know, 2 or 3 of the most important issues that are discussed, and really try to dig through some of the details of that, right? From ideally what we'd have is a couple of creationist readings about it, a couple of evolutionist readings about that, if I use that term, that we've both read beforehand, right? And then we make some notes, and then we discuss that, right? Because then we're working from the same basis of what we're bringing to the table, and we can discuss what we think about that, right? Focusing on a few quite specific things, like maybe some aspect of the fossil evidence or the genetic evidence, or I don't know, whatever you want to talk about, right? Or some creationist claim that you'd like to discuss, because there's generally too many issues. I mean, you can't talk about all of them, right? And some of them aren't as important as others. So that's probably how I would like to do it, if you'd be interested in shaping it that way.
Yeah,
a conversation that way.
Yeah, I think it would be great. Yep, let's do it that way. You can give me homework.
Well, I'd kind of like it to be, so if there was I'm just trying to think. So if there are, maybe you could start the process, right? So you could find a couple of articles or pages or whatever about, I don't know, key creationist claims or refuting evidence for evolution that you think is particularly important and convincing, or should be good evidence, right? And then maybe then what I can do is, maybe if you find a handful of those, and then I can go away and find the best counter to that, and we can select from we can choose a selection of those to focus on, and then discuss them.
Sounds good.
Does that sound?
Let's do it.
I think that might be actually a good way to do it.
Cool. Well, thank you for a wonderful discussion. I don't want to keep you too long, although
No
I know
worries.
if it was on Nathan's channel, you might be willing to stay for 7 or 8 hours.
Well, to be fair, we do plan those in advance, right? I do have other things on today, but yes, it was a pleasure. It was just trying to think. So yeah, we talked about the origin of life, and then we ended up talking about common ancestry for half of it as well. But no, it was good. I think we actually did make a little bit of progress there. I think that if there's one last point that I would like to make, which I don't know that we I don't know that we had a as clear a resolution on this, is the question is about competing explanations, right? So it seems from your point of view that you're of the position that even if we put aside God as an explanation, there are insurmountable implausibilities about a non-intentional naturalistic explanation, either for the development of current life from a last universal common ancestor, but also the emergence of that common ancestor from non-living life. So you think that the evidence that we have about biology and chemistry and whatever is sufficient to render those both extremely implausible, and yes. Evidently, and I feel like this might be putting words in your mouth. So I think this is where I'm not quite sure about where you stand. So let me just clarify this last point.
Sure.
Because at this point, I don't agree with you, but I could agree with you and still be a naturalist, right? I could agree with you and say, yeah, it's actually overwhelmingly unlikely that that life arose from non-living life and that then emerged into current life. But it's even less likely that God would do it this way, or that this would happen. It's even less likely that we would observe what we would observe given an all-loving God, right? So I could, in other words, say that that's even less plausible. And so do you think that, I'm not asking you, do you think it's less plausible? Obviously you don't, right? But I'm asking you, do you think that we still need to have that discussion about how plausible God is as an explanation compared to the naturalistic explanation, even if the naturalistic explanation is still really bad. Because I could think that God is even worse, right?
Well, I mean, I find that strange. So, I mean, maybe that would
Well, of
be
course, you're going to find it strange, right? I
Yeah,
find
but
your view strange, but I'm asking, do we not need to have that conversation as well?
well, it depends. If you want to have that conversation, that's a conversation I would love to have, because I don't understand why you find God so implausible, and like it's kind of, I mean, odd to me that you are dismissing God like so flatly, like that, like it doesn't seem to enter your mind that God could be a possibility.
No, I don't think that's correct. I think I've actually spent a lot of time entertaining the God hypothesis for a range of different phenomena, and I find it extremely wanting as a hypothesis. So I would actually say something like to what you would say. It kind of doesn't matter. I mean, it matters in a comparative sense, but in one sense, it doesn't matter how good or bad the naturalistic evidence for the origin of life is, or for evolution or whatever, because I think that divine explanations or appeals to special creation or whatever are just so terrible as an explanation. I would be more likely to believe in a third explanation, such as panspermia, or that the universe is a simulation or something like that, right? Because, and this is why I said that this is important, right? Because if we're actually interested in cashing this out into worldview change, I could actually accept everything you've said about the implausibilities of the origin of life and evolution. I could accept that and still not believe that God did it, right? Because I could think that that's even worse explanation, and then postulate even other supernatural explanations, like a committee of gods who kind of don't know what they're doing cobbled it together. Like those are actually more plausible options to me for this for these issues, right? And that's one of the reasons, coming back to the book, that I found the book so lacking, is because that it didn't even think that that was a question worth discussing. But if the goal of the book is to convince us that we should look, if the goal of the book is just to convince us that there was no abiogenesis through purely non-intentional naturalistic processes, then that would be fine. But that clearly wasn't the goal of the book, and they say that that's not, right? And so in that respect, I think it fails because it doesn't address this other question as to why we should think that God is at least better than the naturalistic explanation. And I actually do think that I do take that pretty seriously, right? Like an adage that's sometimes given is, I remember this from this was actually from an economics podcast I listened to years ago. It was like a contest for judging, like a pig beauty contest or something. I don't know why, if they even do that, right? But they brought on one of the pigs. It's like, oh, that pig is so hideous. Like, it's the worst pig that I've ever seen. We're going to award it to the other pig because it can't look worse than that. Well, the problem is that you actually have to see them both, right, in order to judge which is better. Even if one is hideous, it's possible the other one is worse, right? So that comparison to me is super important there. And it's not because I reject God out of hand. It's actually because I've thought a lot about it that I think it's really lacking as an explanation.
Okay, well, I mean, I'd love to have all these conversations, but if we are talking about worldview change, and my goal is to get you to see and know God, and what could possibly, is there anything that could possibly help you on that path to changing your worldview at this point? Or do you think you've exhausted it?
No, I think that would be I think that would be absurd to say that one's ever exhausted. Well, unless you become omniscient, I suppose. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. No, I don't buy into that. I've done all the looking I need to, and I've decided. Quite a few Christians I've talked to say that, and atheists as well, and I think that's nonsense. I think that the journey should continue. That being said, I would require significant evidence to change my mind, because I think that there are a lot of things that I've looked at. But in terms of the significance, I really do think that it's the flaws of the God hypothesis, or hypotheses, that are that are at the root here, because many attempts to argue for the existence of God appeal to God as some sort of explanatory postulate in the origin of the universe, or the origin of life, or the resurrection, or other things like that, right? Not all arguments for God are like this, but many of them are, or can be framed in those terms. And I think that in pretty much all cases, it's just a horrifically bad explanation, or even not an explanation at all, depending on how we cash things out. So I think that if that issue could be substantively overcome, then that would change the epistemic landscape considerably. It wouldn't automatically make me believe anything, but if we can improve the performance, so to speak, of God as an explanation for different things, then that does then render it significantly more likely that then it can win out as an explanatory postulate over other things. But to be honest, many theists are just completely reluctant to have this discussion. So, for example, I remember talking to Luke Barnes about fine-tuning when I raised this similar point. He wasn't too interested in talking about that. When I raised this with people in resurrection debates, they're not usually too interested in talking about, like, well, why would God raise Jesus? Or, like, why did he do it this way? Basically, they're unpicking the theistic explanation part of it rather than just focusing on the flaws of naturalism. Almost, like, if you look at William Lane Craig's work, almost all of it is focused on describing why naturalism can't do it or materialism can't do it. And then there's like 2 sentences about how God is a good explanation. To me, that's unsatisfactory. And so, yeah, I think that that's actually, if you're asking what's the key sort of root in here, it's trying to explain or unpack why God is a good explanation for these phenomena and really flesh that out in terms that we can then assess, okay, so why is it better than the competing explanations? So yeah, I would say that's it.
Well, I feel like then you've already listened to the best apologists in the world, right?
No, but I'm saying they don't spend time talking about this. I can prove that they don't, because the amount of time they spend on it is like hundreds of pages versus like one paragraph talking about it. It's just, I'm not saying no one discusses it, right? I think Richard Swinburne has spent a bit more time discussing this, which I do need to read his book. But I mean, I don't know whether you agree with Richard Swinburne, right? You might provide a wholly different explanation, right? So that, you know.
I only know of
Richard
Swinburne from listening to you atheists. I don't I don't read Christian philosophers. I mean,
but that's the point, right? Presumably you have a way that it makes sense.
What? Go ahead.
Presumably you have a way that it makes sense to you, I would hope. And if you're saying you don't know what Richard Swinburne says, then I assume that it's not taken from him, right? So I don't know. If you're saying that you can't offer that because you don't know what other people have said, well, I mean, I don't know what to say to that other than that. You asked what's the sort of lever in. Well, that's it for me, is trying to articulate the theistic hypothesis more clearly and explain why it's a good explanation. And many theists just don't do this.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is there are thinkers who have done more work than I will ever do on this. So I probably couldn't get to you by that route because...
Well, maybe not, right? But that's true for anything we discuss, surely.
But, you know, I guess I would probably take a different approach, which is just talking about God and experiences with him. And, you know, basically like... maybe it's not all about having a perfect philosophy about it, but actually encountering him.
Well, that is another important consideration for me, actually, which is essentially that, now this might come across the wrong way, but let me just articulate this. One thing that I feel like a lot of Christians fail to articulate clearly, at least in apologetics, and maybe I'm looking in the wrong place there, is that what is good about being a Christian? Like, the way I would like to phrase that is, how does it help me to become a better person? To become a Christian? Because actually some Christians that I talk to will say, well, no, actually Christians aren't better people. Like, they're just as sinners as everyone else. And so I'm thinking, like, well, then why bother? Like, if it's supposed to help, if it's just like, oh, because you don't want to go to hell, like, to me, that's a crappy reason for following Jesus. Like, so it's just like, because you don't want to suffer in the future. Like that, I don't know. To me, that's actually really unconvincing and uncompelling. Of course, then there's the epistemic question, is that true, right? But just on a purely like, is that compelling to me as like a decision for leading a good life? Well, no, because you're actually not offering anything. All you're offering is a promissory ticket to like not suffer in the future. And so what I want to know is, how does being a Christian help me to be a better person, in this life? And I'm open to being other lives, but if it can't do anything for me in this life, then it seems pretty lame, to be honest, especially if you're supposed to have the power of Jesus with you and things like that. So that's actually another side that I'm very interested in. And I've found Christian answers often quite lacking, because I feel that kind of evasive. They're like, well, if you have Jesus who comes and like who forgives your sins and who helps you to become a new person, then Christians should be kind of awesome, right? Like, maybe not perfect, but they should be pretty awesome, right? But Christians seem to be just like everyone else, and they're like, oh no, but we still sin. It's like, well, but why? Like, you're supposed to be reborn in Christ. It's like, well, I don't know. I've just found those answers to be very unsatisfactory. So there's another avenue that we could potentially discuss.
And you know what, James? I love this about you. I love that you said, how is that going to help me become a better person? Like, that's really beautiful. And that's something that really I appreciate about who you are, that you're trying to be a better person. And I've, seen things that you do in your life. I mean, not seeing, because I haven't met you in person, but just from talking to you, that I'm very impressed with the ways that you try to be a better person.
Well, I appreciate that. That's nice to say. But I do think that should be, in some sense, the object of all philosophy, right? Like, I think that having true beliefs and thinking through things carefully is an important part of being a better person, but it's certainly not the only part, right? There are other aspects of that as well. So yeah, it's not all about having a neat philosophy. That is very important to me. But yeah, it's not the only thing, and that's one of the reasons why I dislike apologetics that only focuses on that side of it. Or like, well, just is it true or is it not true? Like, I don't know. I feel like I could actually believe, well, depending on which claims you want to bake in there, but like I could believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, for example, and still not find him a compelling figure to follow in my life, for example. That's entirely a consistent belief that I feel like, for example, if Calvinism was correct, I don't think I would, because that sort of God is horrific to me, right? So anyway, so yeah, to me that side of it is very important too.
Yeah, well, I'd love to have a conversation about that, and so yeah, let's plan something, and
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being here today. It's really been wonderful. Thank you, everybody in the chat. I was kind of ignoring the chat a lot today. I did see some chat comments and stuff, but I was trying to concentrate on what James was saying.
Yeah,
so
I was ignoring it as well, but I do see we have 1,300 comments there. So apparently people had fun. But I'm not going to look at that because I can imagine what it ended up like.
Oh, I'm sure they're all on your side, James. They're all saying how stupid Rebecca is and how I should listen to you.
I would not assume that. If I can add one thing, I would encourage people to, if they're interested in these questions. Obviously, we couldn't do justice to all of these issues here. So I think there's a lot of good resources online to read about, like evolution, abiogenesis, and creationism as well. If you read both sides, I think that's useful. And yeah, so just if you look on the Wikipedia page the Wikipedia page of abiogenesis is not a bad place to start. It has lots of other good resources as well. So if you're interested in reading more, I encourage people to check this out for yourself, because I don't claim to have presented everything, in all the detail or anything like that. And I'm not an expert. This is just what I've said is based on my understanding and readings that I've done. Just wanted to add that caveat.
Yeah, and I actually just had a conversation about abiogenesis with Dessel Drace on my Examining Evolution channel on Thursday.
I forgot that you had that channel.
What's that?
I forgot that you had that channel. I did know that, but I forgot.
Yeah, and he has read so much. He's very knowledgeable on this topic. So I think that is, if anybody wants to watch that, it's a very good, it presents a lot of the latest research. Drace does a good job with that. But okay, before we go, can I answer this question? Because people are really complaining in the chat here that I didn't answer your question about how will Christianity make me a better person. Well, I think I could spend a lot of time answering that.
Yeah, so I wasn't expecting like a one sentence or one paragraph answer. That's just a question that's important. But if you want to give the short version,
I'll give the short version. It makes you love people. And so, I mean, that's what it did for me. I would not say I loved people before I was really following Jesus. Now, I was a Christian in name for my whole life, but or since I was like 8 years old. But when I really started getting to know Jesus, I had an experience that changed me, that made me go from hating people to loving people. And so I think that is one of the major differences in my life of knowing Jesus, is that I really do love people. And that's something that did change. So it didn't come naturally.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's really powerful. Thanks for sharing that. And I'd love to talk about that more sometime.
Yeah. And guys, for those who weren't here in the beginning, there's links to James Fodor's stuff in the description. He has a great podcast called The Science of Everything. It's really wonderful. He does a lot of work on that. And he has a book out. There's a link there. And so thanks again, James, for your time, and for everybody.
No worries. See you guys.
All right. Bye.